When 12-year-old Victoria Manning lay in that sterile hospital bed, clutching the hand of Maria Santos, a woman the world saw as nothing more than hired help, nobody could have predicted that this moment would expose the deepest truths about love, trust, and what really matters when everything falls apart. The most expensive medical team money could buy stood helplessly outside the operating room, while inside, a housekeeper with calloused hands became the only person standing between a terrified child and a life-threatening surgery. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain fell in heavy sheets across Manhattan that October morning, turning the city's concrete arteries into rivers of gray. From the 42nd floor of Presbyterian Hospital, the world below looked like a watercolor painting left in the storm, all blurred edges and running colors. But inside room 4237, the weather was the least of anyone's concerns. Victoria Manning pressed her face against the cold window, watching droplets race each other down the glass. At 12 years old, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that photographers spent fortunes trying to capture: platinum blonde hair that caught light like spun silk, eyes the color of winter sky, and delicate features that belonged in fairy tales rather than hospital rooms. Yet beneath that porcelain perfection lay a fear so profound it seemed to radiate from her small frame like heat from a fever. Behind her, the room buzzed with controlled chaos. Dr. Jonathan Pierce, Manhattan's most renowned pediatric cardiac surgeon, stood reviewing charts with the intensity of a general planning battle. His reputation preceded him into every room: Harvard Medical School valedictorian, published researcher, the man wealthy families called when their children's lives hung in the balance. Today, however, his usual confidence seemed strained. The surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning would be delicate, complex, requiring steady hands and absolute trust between surgeon and patient. Victoria had been born with a rare congenital heart defect that had gone undetected until 3 weeks ago, when she collapsed during a piano recital at her exclusive private school. The condition was operable, but the window for intervention was narrow, and every day they delayed increased the risks exponentially. Standing near the door, arms crossed like a sentinel guarding his kingdom, was Robert Manning. At 45, he commanded rooms with the same ease other men commanded attention. CEO and founder of Manning Global Industries, he had built an empire from nothing, turning a small construction company into a multinational corporation worth billions. His success had been built on control, on the ability to solve any problem by throwing enough money and influence at it until it bent to his will. Today, for the first time in decades, that control had completely abandoned him. The first specialist had come highly recommended from Johns Hopkins. Dr. Elizabeth Chen was a woman whose surgical precision was legendary, whose patient survival rate was the envy of cardiac surgeons worldwide. She had entered the room with gentle confidence, speaking to Victoria in soft tones about the procedure, explaining each step with the patience of someone accustomed to frighten children. Victoria had taken one look at the surgeon's kind face and retreated so far under her hospital blankets that only the top of her head remained visible. When Dr. Chen attempted to approach the bed, Victoria began hyperventilating, her breathing becoming so rapid and shallow that nurses had to administer oxygen. The second opinion came from Dr. Marcus Webb at Mount Sinai, a man whose bedside manner was known throughout New York's medical community. He brought coloring books and spoke to Victoria about her favorite movies, trying to establish rapport before discussing the surgery. The result was the same: the moment he mentioned the operation, Victoria curled into a ball and refused to acknowledge his presence. Dr. Sarah Coleman from Columbia Presbyterian tried a different approach, bringing a therapy dog and speaking about the surgery as if it were an adventure. Victoria remained stone silent, staring at the wall with the intensity of someone trying to will herself invisible. By the fourth consultation, Robert Manning's patience had evaporated entirely. He stood in the hallway outside Victoria's room, his usually perfectly styled gray hair disheveled from running his hands through it, his $2,000 suit wrinkled from hours of pacing. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to his assistant, James Morrison, a thin man who had managed Robert's schedule and crises for 15 years. "I've brought her the best surgeons on the East Coast. These are people with waiting lists 6 months long, and she won't even look at them." James adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses nervously. Perhaps she needs more time to process everything, Mr. Manning. This has all happened very quickly. Robert's jaw tightened. Time was a luxury they didn't have. The cardiologists had been clear, Victoria's condition was deteriorating. What had been manageable 3 weeks ago was now approaching critical. Every day they waited, every consultation that ended in failure, brought his daughter closer to a point where surgery might not be enough. He thought about Victoria's mother, Catherine, and how she would have handled this situation. Catherine had possessed an intuitive understanding of their daughter that Robert had never quite managed to replicate. She could calm Victoria's nightmares with a touch, could coax her out of stubborn moods with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a knowing smile. But Catherine had been gone for 2 years now, taken by a drunk driver on a rain-soaked highway, leaving Robert to navigate parenthood alone in a world that suddenly felt impossibly complex. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who could negotiate billion-dollar deals with world leaders, who had built skyscrapers and influenced policy, couldn't convince his own daughter to trust the people trying to save her life. Inside the hospital room, Victoria continued her vigil at the window. She understood more than the adults around her seemed to realize. She knew her heart was broken, not in the metaphorical sense she'd learned about in books, but literally, mechanically broken. She knew that tomorrow, strangers wanted to cut her open and fix what was wrong inside her chest. She knew her father was scared, though he tried to hide it behind phone calls and meetings and the brisk efficiency that had defined her entire life. What she couldn't understand was why everyone expected her to trust people she'd never met, people who spoke in medical terms and looked at her with professional sympathy rather than genuine care. In her 12 years of life, Victoria had learned that most adults wanted something from her family: access to her father's wealth, social connections, business opportunities. The idea that these surgeons were different, that they cared about her beyond what her father could pay them, felt impossible to believe. The door opened quietly, and Maria Santos entered carrying a lunch tray. At 38, Maria possessed a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from her very bones. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same navy blue uniform she'd worn every day for the past 8 years. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance: average height, kind brown eyes, hands that showed the evidence of decades spent cleaning and caring for others. Yet when she entered a room, something shifted. The chaos seemed to settle, the tension seemed to breathe. Maria had come to work for the Manning family when Victoria was 4 years old, hired initially to help manage the household staff in their Fifth Avenue penthouse. But as is often the case with the best domestic workers, her role had expanded organically over the years. She became the person who remembered that Victoria preferred her sandwiches cut diagonally, who knew that the little girl was afraid of thunder, who could French braid hair and remove impossible stains from expensive clothing with equal skill. More importantly, she had become the person Victoria trusted most in the world. "Mija," Maria said softly, using the Spanish endearment she'd called Victoria since childhood, "you haven't touched your breakfast." Victoria turned from the window, and for the first time all morning, her expression softened. "I'm not hungry, Maria." "I know, little one. But your body needs strength for what's coming." Maria set the tray on the bedside table and sat carefully on the edge of the hospital bed. "Your father is very worried about you." "He's worried about the business," Victoria replied, a bitterness in her voice that seemed too old for her 12 years. "He's worried about his reputation. He's not worried about me." Maria's heart ached at the resignation in the child's voice. She had watched this relationship deteriorate over the past 2 years, had seen Robert retreat further into his work while Victoria grew increasingly isolated in the cold perfection of their penthouse life. Catherine's death had broken something fundamental between father and daughter, leaving them like strangers sharing the same beautiful, empty space. "That's not true, and you know it," Maria said gently. "He's scared. Sometimes when people are scared, they don't know how to show love properly." "Then why won't he listen to me?" Victoria's voice cracked slightly. "I keep telling him I don't want those doctors touching me, but he just keeps bringing more of them. It's like he thinks if he pays enough money, I'll just do what he wants." Maria nodded slowly. She had witnessed every consultation, had seen Victoria's growing panic with each new face that appeared claiming they could fix her. The child's fear wasn't irrational, it was the product of a lifetime spent watching her father treat relationships as transactions, watching people perform kindness in exchange for access to the Manning fortune. "What if," Maria said carefully, "there was a way for you to have the surgery you need, but on your own terms?" Victoria looked at her with cautious interest. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you could choose who stays with you during the operation? What if you could have someone there who cares about you, not about your father's money?" "They won't let me do that," Victoria said, but there was hope in her voice now. "Daddy says only medical people are allowed in the operating room." Maria smiled, and there was something almost mischievous in her expression. "Your daddy has a lot of money and a lot of influence. If he really wanted to make something happen, he could find a way." For the first time in weeks, Victoria felt a spark of possibility. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The surgery still terrified her. The idea of being unconscious while strangers cut into her chest made her stomach twist with fear. But the thought of Maria being there, of having someone who truly cared about her well-being rather than the successful completion of a procedure, made the prospect seem almost bearable. "You would do that for me?" Victoria asked quietly. "You would stay with me during the surgery?" "Mija," Maria said, taking the girl's small hand in both of hers, "I would do anything for you. You are not my employer's daughter to me. You are my heart." The simple sincerity of those words broke something open in Victoria's chest. She had spent so much of her life surrounded by people who were paid to care for her, tutors and nannies and household staff who were kind but professionally distant. Maria was different. Maria had stayed late countless nights when Victoria had nightmares. Maria had taught her to make empanadas and braided her hair for school pictures and never once made Victoria feel like a burden or an obligation. "But Daddy will never agree to it," Victoria said, practical even in her hopefulness. "He thinks you're just the housekeeper." Maria's expression grew serious. "Then we'll have to help him understand that sometimes the most important qualifications can't be bought or earned in a classroom." Outside in the hallway, Robert Manning was experiencing his own crisis of faith. He stood looking through the window at his daughter, watching her animated conversation with Maria, and felt a familiar stab of jealousy mixed with guilt. Somehow, a woman he paid to clean his house had managed to maintain a connection with Victoria that he, her own father, seemed incapable of achieving. It hadn't always been this way. When Victoria was small, before Catherine's death, he had been present in ways that mattered. He had read bedtime stories and attended school plays and coached her soccer team on weekends. But grief had changed him, had made him retreat into the safe predictability of work, where problems had solutions and success could be measured in concrete terms. Watching Victoria now, seeing her smile for the first time in days, Robert realized that his approach to her medical crisis had been fundamentally flawed. He had been trying to solve the problem the way he solved business problems, by finding the best experts and expecting excellence in return for premium payment. He had forgotten that his daughter wasn't a business deal to be closed or a problem to be outsourced to specialists. She was a frightened child who needed to feel safe. Dr. Pierce approached from behind, his expression grim. "Mr. Manning, we need to make a decision. Victoria's latest tests show continued deterioration. If we wait much longer, we'll be operating in emergency conditions, which significantly increases the risks." Robert nodded absently, still watching his daughter through the window. "She won't accept any of the surgeons. Every consultation ends the same way." "Perhaps," Dr. Pierce said carefully, "we should consider what might make her more comfortable with the procedure, rather than focusing solely on finding the right surgeon." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the skill of the surgeon is only one factor in surgical success. Patient cooperation and psychological state are equally important. A terrified patient is more likely to experience complications than a calm one." Robert turned to face the doctor fully. "Are you suggesting we sedate her into compliance?" "Not at all. I'm suggesting we find out what would make her feel secure during the procedure and then do everything in our power to accommodate those needs." Through the window, Robert watched Maria help Victoria eat a few bites of soup, coaxing her with gentle encouragement. The scene was so domestic, so natural, that it took him a moment to recognize the obvious solution. "Doctor," he said slowly, "what would it take to allow a non-medical person to be present during the surgery?" Dr. Pierce raised an eyebrows. "That's highly irregular. Operating rooms have strict protocols about who can be present during procedures." "But not impossible?" "Well, no. In extreme circumstances, we have allowed family members to be present, particularly for pediatric patients. There would need to be extensive health screenings, special training sessions, appropriate protective gear. The person would need to understand that they must remain completely still and silent, that they cannot interfere with the medical team in any way." Robert felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of frustration and fear that had been growing for days. "And if I were to make a substantial donation to the hospital's pediatric wing? Would that help expedite the approval process?" Dr. Pierce smiled for the first time since entering the conversation. "Mr. Manning, I think we can work something out." That evening, Robert entered Victoria's hospital room with more nervousness than he'd felt before any business meeting in his career. His daughter was curled up in bed while Maria sat in the chair beside her, both of them watching a movie on the small television mounted to the wall. "Victoria," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I need to talk to you about tomorrow." Victoria's expression immediately closed off, her body tensing in preparation for another argument about surgical consent. "I know you're scared," Robert continued, moving to sit on the foot of her bed. "I know you don't trust the doctors, and I understand why. They're strangers to you. They don't know that you're afraid of butterflies but love ladybugs, or that you read chapter books under your covers with a flashlight, or that you've never missed a day of school in your entire life." Victoria looked at him with surprise. These were details she hadn't realized he knew, small pieces of her personality that she thought he was too busy to notice. "But Maria knows these things about you," Robert said, glancing at the housekeeper with something approaching respect. "Maria knows you better than anyone, including me. And if having her with you during the surgery would make you feel safe enough to go through with it, then that's what we're going to do." Victoria sat up straighter, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Really? Maria can stay with me? Really? Dr. Pierce has agreed to allow it, with certain conditions. Maria will need to complete some training sessions tomorrow morning, and there are health requirements she'll need to meet, but if you're willing to have the surgery, she can be right there with you the entire time." For the first time since entering the hospital, Victoria smiled. It wasn't the polite, practiced smile she wore for photographs or school events, but a genuine expression of relief and gratitude. She looked at Maria, who nodded encouragingly. "Okay," Victoria said quietly. "If Maria can be there, then I'll do it." Robert felt his own relief wash over him like a wave. He reached out and took his daughter's hand, surprised by how small and fragile it felt in his own. "I know I haven't been the father you needed these past couple of years," he said. "I know I've been distracted and distant, and I'm sorry for that. But I want you to know that you are the most important thing in my world. More important than any business deal or any amount of money." Victoria squeezed his hand. "I know, Daddy. I've always known." As Robert left the hospital that night, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that Victoria had finally agreed to the surgery, certainly, but also a profound gratitude toward Maria Santos that he wasn't sure how to express. This woman, whom he had consistently undervalued and taken for granted, had just saved his daughter's life in ways that went far beyond what would happen in tomorrow's operating room. She had reminded both of them what love actually looked like. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm of the previous day having blown itself out overnight. Maria arrived at the hospital before sunrise, carrying a small bag containing the items Victoria had requested for after the surgery, a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, a photograph of her mother, and a small stuffed elephant that had been her companion since toddlerhood. She had spent most of the night awake, thinking about the responsibility she was about to undertake. In a few hours, she would be standing in an operating room while surgeons worked to repair a 12-year-old girl's heart. She would be the only familiar face Victoria would see before the anesthesia took effect, the only source of comfort and security in a room full of strangers focused on the technical aspects of saving a life. It was, she realized, the most important job she had ever been asked to do. Dr. Pierce met her in the pre-surgery area, where she spent 2 hours learning about operating room protocols, proper sterile procedures, and exactly where she would be positioned during the operation. The nurses showed her how to wear the surgical gown and mask, how to move through the operating room without contaminating the sterile field, and most importantly, how to provide comfort to Victoria without interfering with the medical team's work. Remember, Dr. Pierce said as they finished the orientation, your job is to be a calming presence. Talk to her before we begin, help her feel secure. Once we start the procedure, you'll need to remain completely silent and still. Can you do that? Maria nodded. Doctor, can I ask you something? Of course. How dangerous is this surgery? Dr. Pierce was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Any cardiac surgery carries risks, especially in pediatric patients. But Victoria's condition is operable, and we've caught it before it became critical. With a cooperative patient and an experienced surgical team, I'm optimistic about the outcome. And if we had waited longer, then we would have been having a very different conversation. At 10 o'clock, they wheeled Victoria into the preoperative area. She looked impossibly small on the adult-sized gurney, her blonde hair tucked under a surgical cap, her eyes wide with fear despite her earlier bravery. When she saw Maria waiting for her in full surgical attire, her expression immediately relaxed. You look like a real doctor, Victoria said, managing a small smile. I feel like I'm playing dress-up, Maria replied, adjusting her surgical mask. But I'm here, Mija. Just like I promised. Robert appeared beside the gurney, having changed into surgical scrubs as well. Hospital policy allowed him to accompany Victoria to the operating room doors, though he couldn't enter the surgery itself. He looked older somehow, the weight of the past few weeks visible in the new lines around his eyes. I'll be waiting right outside the entire time, he told Victoria, leaning down to kiss her forehead. When you wake up, I'll be the first person you see. After Maria, Victoria corrected, and Robert smiled. After Maria, he agreed. As they wheeled Victoria toward the operating room, Maria walked beside the gurney, holding the girl's hand. She could feel Victoria's pulse racing through her small fingers, could see the fear returning as they approached the heavy doors marked authorized personnel only. Tell me about the beach house, Victoria said suddenly, her voice tight with anxiety. Maria understood immediately. It was a game they had played for years, a story Maria had invented about an imaginary beach house where they would someday spend a perfect vacation together. Over time, the story had grown elaborate, they had furnished every room, planned every meal, imagined every activity they would enjoy together. Well, Maria said as they entered the operating room, I was thinking we might finally get that hammock we've been talking about. The kind that's big enough for both of us to read in together. The operating room was blindingly bright and filled with equipment that looked more like machines from a science fiction movie than medical devices. Nurses moved efficiently around the space, preparing instruments and monitors while the anesthesiologist checked his equipment one final time. Victoria's grip on Maria's hand tightened as they transferred her from the gurney to the operating table. The room felt cold and sterile, nothing like the warm, comfortable world Maria had created with her stories. And we'll hang it between those two palm trees, Maria continued, positioning herself beside Victoria's head where she could maintain eye contact. The ones that are perfect for watching the sunset. Dr. Pierce approached with his surgical team, all of them masked and gowned and radiating professional competence. Victoria, he said gently, we're going to give you some medicine now to help you sleep. When you wake up, everything will be fixed. Victoria looked up at Maria with panic starting to creep into her expression. The anesthesiologist was preparing the foreline that would carry the drugs that would render her unconscious and helpless. Maria, she whispered, what if I don't wake up? Maria felt her own heart skip a beat at the question, but she kept her voice steady and calm. You will wake up, Mija. I promise you that. And when you do, we're going to start planning that beach house for real. Really? Really? I've been saving money for years, and I think it's time we stopped imagining and started doing. The anesthesiologist began administering the medication, and Victoria's eyelids started to grow heavy. "Will you stay right here?" she murmured, her words beginning to slur slightly. "I'm not going anywhere," Maria promised. "I'll be right here the entire time." Victoria's eyes fluttered closed, and her breathing deepened into the artificial rhythm of anesthesia. Around them, the surgical team sprang into action with practiced efficiency, but Maria remained exactly where she was, one hand resting gently on Victoria's shoulder, silently keeping her promise to stay. As Dr. Pierce made the first incision, beginning the delicate work of repairing a 12-year-old girl's broken heart, Maria Santos stood as witness to a different kind of healing altogether. In this sterile room filled with strangers, she had become the bridge between fear and trust, between isolation and love, between a frightened child and the medical miracle that would save her life. Outside the operating room doors, Robert Manning sat in a waiting room chair that cost less than his daily coffee budget, learning for the first time in his adult life what it meant to be completely powerless. All his wealth, all his influence, all his ability to control outcomes through sheer force of will, meant nothing in this moment. His daughter's life was in the hands of people he barely knew, and the only person providing her comfort was a woman whose importance he had consistently overlooked. As he sat there, surrounded by other families facing their own medical crises, Robert began to understand something fundamental about the nature of value. The most precious things in life, trust, love, genuine care, couldn't be purchased or negotiated. They had to be earned through consistency, through presence, through the kind of daily devotion that Maria had shown his daughter for 8 years. Money had bought him the best surgeons, the finest hospital, the most advanced equipment. But it was Maria's calloused hands and genuine love that had made the surgery possible at all. The operation would take 4 hours. 4 hours during which Victoria's life hung in the balance, during which Dr. Pierce and his team worked with microscopic precision to repair the defect that had been threatening her since birth. But in a larger sense, the healing had begun the moment Maria Santos walked into that operating room and proved that sometimes the most qualified person for a job is simply the one who loves you most. In the end, that would make all the difference. The silence in the operating room was broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft whisper of the ventilator breathing for Victoria. Maria had never realized how loud silence could be until she found herself surrounded by it in this sterile cathedral of modern medicine. Every sound seemed amplified, the gentle whir of machines, the soft shuffle of surgical shoes against polished floors, the occasional murmured communication between team members. Dr. Pierce worked with the focused intensity of a master craftsman, his hands moving with deliberate precision as he navigated the delicate landscape of Victoria's chest cavity. The heart defect was exactly as the diagnostic images had shown, a septal defect that had gone undetected for 12 years, allowing oxygenated and deoxygenated blood to mix in ways that placed enormous strain on Victoria's cardiovascular system. Maria watched the monitors that surrounded Victoria like electronic guardians, their green lines and digital readouts painting a picture of life in mathematical terms. She didn't understand the medical significance of the numbers, but she had been told that steady, consistent patterns were good signs. The anesthesiologist sat at Victoria's head, monitoring her breathing and vital signs with the vigilance of a lighthouse keeper watching for ships in dangerous waters. "How are you holding up?" whispered Dr. Lisa Chen, the surgical nurse who had been assigned to keep Maria informed throughout the procedure. She was a small woman with kind eyes visible above her surgical mask, someone who clearly understood the emotional weight of Maria's presence in this room. "I'm okay," Maria replied quietly, though her legs had begun to ache from standing in the same position for over an hour. The surgical gown felt heavy and strange on her body, and the mask made every breath feel labored and warm. But she remained exactly where Dr. Pierce had positioned her, one hand resting lightly on Victoria's shoulder, a physical reminder that love was present in this room of strangers. Through the observation window, she could see Robert pacing in the hallway outside. He had been walking the same path for the past 90 minutes, 15 steps to the right, turn, 15 steps to the left, turn, repeat. His expensive suit had been replaced by hospital scrubs that made him look younger somehow, more vulnerable, like any other worried parent facing the possibility of loss. James Morrison sat in one of the uncomfortable waiting room chairs, his laptop balanced on his knees as he fielded the endless stream of calls and emails that followed Robert Manning wherever he went. But even from her position in the operating room, Maria could see that Robert's attention was entirely focused on the surgery, his business empire temporarily forgotten in favor of the only thing that truly mattered. Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the quiet hum of the operating room as he began the most critical phase of the repair. "We're approaching the defect now. I can see the extent of the damage clearly. It's exactly what we expected from the imaging, which is good news. No surprises, no complications visible." Maria felt her grip on Victoria's shoulder tighten involuntarily. She had been told that the repair itself would be the most delicate part of the surgery, requiring Dr. Pierce to essentially rebuild a portion of Victoria's heart using a combination of the girl's own tissue and synthetic materials designed to grow with her as she matured. "Talk to her," Dr. Chen whispered to Maria. Even under anesthesia, patients can sometimes hear familiar voices. It might help keep her calm. Maria leaned closer to Victoria's face, careful not to interfere with any of the medical equipment. The girl looked impossibly peaceful, her usually expressive features relaxed in artificial sleep. Her blonde hair had been completely tucked under the surgical cap, making her appear even younger and more fragile than usual. "Remember when we were planning the garden for the beach house?" Maria whispered, her voice so soft that only Victoria could possibly hear. "You wanted to plant sunflowers along the back fence, the kind that grow taller than both of us put together. You said we could have contests to see who could grow the tallest one each summer." The monitors continued their steady rhythm, Victoria's vital signs remaining stable as Dr. Pierce worked to repair the defect that had been silently threatening her life for 12 years. Maria had learned from the pre-surgical consultations that children could live for years with certain types of heart defects, their bodies compensating remarkably well until the compensation mechanisms themselves began to fail. Victoria had been lucky in some ways. Her defect had been discovered before permanent damage occurred to her lungs or other organs. But Maria also knew that luck was a finite resource, and they had been living on borrowed time since the moment Victoria collapsed during her piano recital 3 weeks ago. "We're making excellent progress," Dr. Pierce announced, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a professional who was performing exactly as he had trained to perform. "The repair is going smoothly. No unexpected bleeding, no complications with the patch material. We should be able to close within the next hour." Maria felt tears prick her eyes at the news, a release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She looked through the observation window and saw Robert stop his pacing, his attention focused entirely on Dr. Pierce's words being relayed to him through the intercom system. The surgical nurse who had been assisting Dr. Pierce looked up from her instrument tray with a smile visible in her eyes. "She's a strong little girl," she said to Maria. "Her vitals have been rock steady throughout the entire procedure. That's not always the case with pediatric cardiac patients." Maria nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that had suddenly clogged her throat. She thought about all the moments that had led to this one, 8 years of daily interactions, of braiding hair and packing lunches and reading bedtime stories. 8 years of watching Victoria grow from a 4-year-old who still needed help tying her shoes into a 12-year-old who could discuss literature with her tutors and play Chopin with technical precision. But more than that, she thought about the invisible moments that had built their relationship. The quiet conversations late at night when Victoria couldn't sleep after her mother died. The patient explanations of why people sometimes left and never came back, delivered in language a grieving child could understand. The steady presence during thunderstorms and bad dreams and the countless small fears that accompany growing up in a world that often felt too large and unpredictable. Those moments hadn't felt significant at the time. Maria had simply been doing her job, caring for a child who needed stability and affection in a life that had been turned upside down by loss. She had never imagined that her presence would become so essential to Victoria's sense of security that a medical procedure would hinge on her willingness to stand in an operating room for 4 hours. "You know," whispered Dr. Chen during a brief lull in the surgical activity, I've been working in pediatric surgery for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Usually, when children are afraid of surgery, we work with child psychologists or use sedation protocols to manage their anxiety. I've never seen a patient who would only accept comfort from their housekeeper. Maria looked down at Victoria's peaceful face, considering how to explain a relationship that she herself didn't fully understand. She lost her mother when she was 10, she said finally. Her father is a good man, but he doesn't know how to be present in the ways she needs. I think I became the person she trusted to stay. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Trust is interesting in medical settings. We expect patients to trust us based on our credentials and expertise, but children especially need emotional trust before they can accept medical intervention. You provided something that no amount of medical training could have given her. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Pierce's voice as he began the closing procedures. We're ready to remove the heart-lung bypass machine and allow Victoria's heart to resume normal function. This is always a critical moment in cardiac surgery. We'll know immediately whether the repair was successful. Maria felt her own heart skip a beat at the implications of what Dr. Pierce was saying. For the past 2 hours, Victoria's life had been sustained entirely by machines while her heart was stopped and repaired. Now, they would discover whether the repair was successful, whether Victoria's heart could resume its essential work of keeping her alive. The next few minutes felt like hours as the surgical team worked to transition Victoria from mechanical life support back to natural cardiac function. Maria watched the monitors intently, though she didn't understand most of what the numbers and waveforms represented. She simply focused on the steady beeping that had provided the soundtrack to the entire surgery, willing it to continue, willing Victoria's repaired heart to accept the work it had been given. There, Dr. Pierce said, and Maria could hear the smile in his voice even through the surgical mask. Beautiful rhythm. Strong contractions. The repair is holding perfectly. We have successful separation from bypass. Through the observation window, Maria saw Robert sink into one of the plastic chairs, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with relief. James Morrison closed his laptop and placed a supportive hand on his employer's shoulder, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. The closing procedures took another 45 minutes, time spent ensuring that every incision was properly sealed, that bleeding was controlled, that Victoria's chest cavity was clean and protected against infection. Maria remained in position throughout, her hand never leaving Victoria's shoulder, her whispered stories continuing even as her voice grew hoarse from hours of quiet talking. Finally, Dr. Pierce stepped back from the operating table, pulling off his surgical gloves with the satisfied movement of someone who had completed difficult work successfully. That, he announced to the room, was a textbook repair. Victoria is going to make a full recovery. The surgical nurses began the process of preparing Victoria for transport to the intensive care unit, where she would spend the next 24 hours under constant monitoring as her body adjusted to its newly repaired heart. Maria remained close by, helping to guide the gurney through the corridors while maintaining physical contact with Victoria throughout the journey. The ICU was a different kind of medical environment, quieter than the operating room, but filled with more sophisticated monitoring equipment and a higher ratio of nurses to patients. Victoria was settled into a private room with glass walls that would allow the medical staff to observe her constantly while she recovered from the anesthesia. Robert was waiting when they arrived, having changed back into his business suit but somehow looking entirely different than he had that morning. The expensive clothing couldn't hide the vulnerability that had been exposed by the past 4 hours, the recognition that all his wealth and influence had been powerless to help his daughter in the way that mattered most. "How is she?" he asked Dr. Pierce, though his eyes were focused entirely on Victoria's sleeping form. "The surgery was completely successful," Dr. Pierce replied. "The repair is solid, her heart rhythm is strong, and there were no complications. She'll be unconscious for another hour or two as the anesthesia wears off, but when she wakes up, she's going to feel better than she has in months." Robert nodded, then turned to Maria with an expression she had never seen from him before. It was gratitude, certainly, but something deeper than that, a recognition of value that transcended any employment relationship they had ever had. "I don't know how to thank you," he said simply. What you did today, he stopped, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come naturally to a man accustomed to expressing everything in terms of business transactions. She's like my own daughter, Maria replied, and in saying it, she realized how completely true it was. At some point over the past 8 years, her feelings for Victoria had transcended professional duty and become something approaching maternal love. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, Robert said firmly. Not anyone would have spent 4 hours in an operating room. Not anyone would have earned the kind of trust that made this surgery possible. What you did today saved Victoria's life in ways that go far beyond the medical procedure. Dr. Pierce had been listening to this conversation with the interest of someone who had seen many families navigate medical crises, but rarely with the kind of complexity that money and class differences could introduce. Mr. Manning, he said, you should know that Maria's presence during the surgery made a measurable difference in Victoria's stress responses. Her vital signs were remarkably stable throughout the entire procedure. That kind of calm can significantly impact surgical outcomes. Over the next several hours, as Victoria slowly emerged from the anesthesia, Maria remained at her bedside. The ICU allowed only 2 visitors at a time, so she and Robert took turns sitting with Victoria while James Morrison managed the stream of business calls and media inquiries that had begun once news of Victoria's surgery became known among the Manning family's extensive social and professional networks. When Victoria finally opened her eyes, blinking slowly in the soft light of the ICU room, the first face she saw was Maria's. The older woman was exactly where she had promised to be, exactly where Victoria had needed her to be during the most frightening experience of her young life. Did it work? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper due to the breathing tube that had been removed only an hour earlier. It worked perfectly, Maria replied, gently smoothing Victoria's hair back from her forehead. Your heart is fixed, Mija. Dr. Pierce says you're going to feel stronger than you've felt in years. Victoria managed a small smile, then noticed the 4 lines and monitoring equipment that connected her to various machines. How long do I have to stay here? A few days in the hospital, then a few weeks of taking things easy at home. But then you can do anything you want, run, swim, play sports if you're interested. Your heart is going to be strong enough for all of it. Robert appeared in the doorway, having been alerted by the ICU nurse that Victoria was awake. He approached the bed cautiously, still uncertain of his welcome after months of feeling like a stranger in his own daughter's life. Hi, Daddy, Victoria said, and her voice was warmer than it had been in months. The shared experience of the surgery, the recognition of how much her father had wanted to help her even when his methods were misguided, had created an opening for reconciliation that hadn't existed before. Hi, sweetheart, Robert replied, settling into the chair on the opposite side of Victoria's bed from Maria. How are you feeling? Tired. And sore. But different somehow. Like I can breathe deeper than before. Dr. Pierce had explained that this was a common experience for patients who had lived with heart defects for extended periods. Once the defect was repaired, the improved circulation often made patients feel dramatically better almost immediately, even while they were still recovering from the surgery itself. Maria stayed with me the whole time, Victoria said, looking between her father and the woman who had become her anchor. Just like she promised. Robert nodded, understanding that this was information he needed to acknowledge, needed to honor properly. She did something extraordinary today. Something I couldn't do, even with all the resources available to me. Maria felt uncomfortable with the praise, unsure how to navigate this new dynamic where her relationship with Victoria was being recognized as something more significant than household employment. I just did what anyone who loves her would do, she said. No, Victoria said, her voice gaining strength as she became more fully awake. Not anyone would have done it. Not anyone could have done it. You're the only person I trust that much. The implications of Victoria's words settled over the room like a gentle revelation. This 12-year-old girl, born into extraordinary privilege and surrounded by resources that most families could never access, had found her greatest security in the love of a woman whose formal education had ended with high school, whose life savings wouldn't cover a month of Victoria's private school tuition. It was a reminder that the most essential human needs, love, trust, security, couldn't be purchased or negotiated. They had to be earned through presence, through consistency, through the kind of daily devotion that Maria had shown Victoria for 8 years without ever expecting recognition or reward beyond her modest salary. As evening approached and Victoria drifted back into natural sleep, Robert and Maria found themselves alone together in the ICU family waiting area. The space was designed for difficult conversations, comfortable chairs arranged in small groupings, soft lighting that didn't feel clinical, windows that looked out over the city rather than into medical corridors. "I owe you an apology," Robert said, settling into one of the chairs with a heaviness that spoke of emotional exhaustion. "For years, I've taken your relationship with Victoria for granted. I've thought of you as an employee rather than recognizing what you actually are to her." Maria chose her words carefully. "You've always been fair to me as an employer, Mr. Manning. You pay me well, you've never asked me to do anything unreasonable, but I've never acknowledged that what you do goes far beyond cleaning and household management," Robert interrupted. "You've been the most consistent source of love and stability in Victoria's life, especially since Catherine died. I was so focused on providing for her financially that I lost sight of what she actually needed." "Grief affects everyone differently," Maria said gently. "You did the best you could with the tools you had." Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The tools I had were money and influence and the ability to hire experts to solve problems. None of those tools were useful when my daughter needed emotional security more than anything else." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing the events of the day and their implications for the future. Through the windows, the lights of Manhattan were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, the city carrying on with its relentless energy while they existed in this bubble of hospital time where different priorities ruled. "I want to ask you something," Robert said finally, "and I want you to know that there's no pressure to say yes. Your job security doesn't depend on your answer, and if you're not comfortable with what I'm suggesting, we can continue exactly as we have been." Maria nodded, curious but wary. "I want to formally acknowledge your role in Victoria's life. Not as household staff, but as someone who has genuine authority when it comes to decisions about her well-being. I want to set up a trust fund that will provide for your financial security, and I want to make sure you have legal standing to make medical decisions for Victoria if I'm ever unavailable." Maria stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. "Mr. Manning, I'm not asking you to replace me as Victoria's father," Robert continued. "But I am asking you to let me formally recognize what you've already been doing informally for years. You've been co-parenting my daughter, and you've been doing it better than I have in many ways." The offer was overwhelming in its implications. Financial security beyond anything Maria had ever imagined, legal recognition of her relationship with Victoria, acknowledgement from Robert that her role in the family was essential rather than auxiliary. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because today proved what I should have recognized years ago, that Victoria's well-being depends on your presence in her life. Because you've earned the right to have your contributions valued properly. And because I don't want to risk losing you due to my own failure to appreciate what you bring to our family." Maria thought about her own family, about the modest apartment in Queens where she still lived with her elderly mother and younger sister. She thought about the years of taking 2 buses and a subway train to reach the Manning penthouse each morning, about the careful budgeting required to make her salary cover her family's expenses while still saving small amounts for emergencies. But more than that, she thought about Victoria, about the little girl who had become the center of her emotional world, whose happiness and security had become more important to Maria than her own comfort. The formal recognition Robert was offering would change the practical circumstances of her life dramatically, but it would also acknowledge something that had already been true for years. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Not because I don't want to continue caring for Victoria, but because this is bigger than just employment. If I accept what you're offering, we become something more like a real family, with all the complications that might involve." Robert nodded, understanding her hesitation. "Take all the time you need. The offer will remain open regardless of how long you need to decide." They were interrupted by Dr. Pierce's arrival in the waiting area, still wearing his surgical scrubs but looking relaxed and satisfied in the way that physicians do when complex procedures have concluded successfully. "I wanted to update you on Victoria's progress," he said, settling into one of the remaining chairs. "Her vital signs have been excellent all evening, and she's responding to the anesthesia recovery exactly as we hoped. Barring any unexpected complications, we should be able to move her out of intensive care tomorrow afternoon." "And her long-term prognosis?" Robert asked. "Excellent. The repair we performed today should last her entire lifetime. She'll need regular cardiology follow-ups to monitor her progress, but there's no reason she can't live a completely normal, active life. The defect that was threatening her health has been eliminated." Dr. Pierce turned to Maria with an expression of professional curiosity. "I have to ask, how did you know that your presence during the surgery would make such a difference? Your understanding of Victoria's psychological needs was remarkably sophisticated." Maria considered the question. "I didn't know, exactly. I just knew that she was terrified of trusting strangers with something so important. She needed someone there who cared about her as a person rather than as a medical case." "It's an interesting perspective on patient care," Dr. Pierce mused. "We focus extensively on technical competency and medical expertise, but we sometimes underestimate the importance of emotional security in healing processes. What happened today might be worth studying as a model for other pediatric cases." As the evening wore on and visiting hours came to an end, Maria prepared to leave the hospital for the first time since Victoria's surgery had begun. She felt strange about departing, even though Victoria was sleeping peacefully and would be monitored constantly throughout the night. "Go home and get some rest," Robert said, noticing her reluctance to leave. "I'll stay here tonight, and I'll call you immediately if anything changes. Victoria is going to need you to be rested and healthy during her recovery." Maria nodded, understanding the practical wisdom of his words even as her emotions pulled her toward remaining at Victoria's bedside. She gathered her purse and the small bag she had brought that morning, which seemed like weeks ago rather than hours. As she waited for the elevator that would take her down to the hospital's main floor, Maria reflected on the day's events and their larger significance. When she had arrived at the hospital that morning, she had been a housekeeper who was fond of her employer's daughter. When she left that evening, she had become something entirely different, someone whose love had made a medical miracle possible, someone whose value had been recognized in ways she had never dared to imagine. The subway ride back to Queens gave her time to process these changes and their implications for her future. She thought about Robert's offer, about the financial security and legal recognition he was proposing. She thought about Victoria's recovery and the months of careful nurturing that would be required as the girl adjusted to life with a repaired heart. But mostly, she thought about the moment in the operating room when Victoria had asked if she would wake up, and Maria had promised her that she would. It had been a promise made without any medical knowledge or authority to make such guarantees, but it had been the promise that mattered most in that sterile room full of experts and equipment. Love, Maria realized, was its own kind of expertise. And sometimes, it was the most important qualification of all. When she finally reached her apartment in Queens, Maria found her mother waiting up despite the late hour. Elena Santos was 73 years old, a woman who had spent her own life working as domestic help for wealthy families, who understood the complicated dynamics of caring for other people's children while raising her own. "How did it go, Mija?" Elena asked in Spanish, using the same endearment that Maria used with Victoria. Maria sank into the worn sofa that had been in their family for 15 years, suddenly feeling the emotional and physical exhaustion of the day. "The surgery was successful. Victoria is going to be fine. And you? How are you?" It was a question that no one else had thought to ask during this day focused entirely on Victoria's medical needs. Maria considered how to answer, how to explain the transformation she had undergone in that operating room. "Different," she said finally. "Everything feels different now." Elena nodded with the wisdom of someone who had navigated her own complicated relationships with the families who employed her. When you love a child who isn't yours, but who becomes yours in every way that matters, everything changes. The love doesn't follow employment boundaries. Mr. Manning offered to formally recognize my role in Victoria's life today. Financial security, legal authority to make decisions about her care, acknowledgement that I'm more than just household staff. And how do you feel about that? Maria was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to describe emotions she was still processing. Grateful. Scared. Uncertain about what it might mean for our family, for my relationship with Victoria, for everything. But not uncertain about your love for her, Elena observed. No. Never uncertain about that. Elena reached over and patted her daughter's hand with the gentle gesture of a mother who had watched her child navigate complex emotional territory. Then the rest will work itself out. Love is the foundation that makes everything else possible. As Maria prepared for bed that night, she thought about returning to the hospital the next morning, about continuing Victoria's recovery process, about the conversation she would need to have with Robert regarding his offer of formal recognition. But underlying all those practical considerations was a deeper understanding of what had occurred that day. In agreeing to stay with Victoria during the surgery, Maria had stepped across a line from employee to family member. There would be no going back to the previous dynamic, regardless of what legal or financial arrangements were ultimately made. Victoria's heart had been repaired that day, but something equally significant had happened to the structure of their unconventional family. Love had been acknowledged, valued, and given the respect it deserved. And that, Maria realized as she drifted off to sleep, might be the most important healing of all. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manning penthouse, casting golden rectangles across the polished marble floors that had once felt more like a museum than a home. Victoria sat curled in the window seat of her bedroom, a thick novel balanced on her knees, her fingers absently tracing the healing scar that ran down her chest beneath her soft cotton pajamas. 3 weeks had passed since her surgery, and the physical recovery had been remarkable, better than even Dr. Pierce had predicted. But the emotional transformation that had begun in that operating room was still unfolding in ways that surprised everyone involved. Maria entered the room carrying a breakfast tray, moving with the quiet efficiency that had characterized her work for 8 years. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of their relationship. The crisis that had forced everyone to acknowledge what Maria truly meant to Victoria had created a new kind of intimacy, a recognition that their bond transcended any traditional categories of employment or even guardianship. "Buenos dias, corazón," Maria said, setting the tray on Victoria's bedside table. The endearment rolled off her tongue naturally now, no longer concealed behind the professional distance she had once maintained. "Dr. Pierce said you could start having normal meals this week." Victoria looked up from her book with a smile that seemed brighter somehow, as if the successful surgery had not only repaired her heart but restored something essential to her spirit. "I was thinking about what you said in the hospital. About the beach house not being imaginary anymore." Maria settled into the reading chair beside Victoria's window seat, a piece of furniture she had helped select years earlier when Victoria had first shown serious interest in literature. "What about it? I want to help you plan it for real. Not just stories anymore, but actual blueprints and budgets and everything." Victoria's voice carried an excitement that Maria hadn't heard since before Catherine's death. "Daddy said he wants to talk to both of us today about some changes, and I think it might be connected." Robert had indeed requested a family meeting, though the use of that term had felt both natural and revolutionary when he'd mentioned it the previous evening. For the first time in their long acquaintance, he had explicitly included Maria in a discussion about Victoria's future, acknowledging her role in decisions that would shape the girl's life. The transformation in Robert himself had been perhaps the most dramatic of all. The man who had once treated emotional needs as problems to be solved through financial expenditure had begun to understand the difference between providing for his daughter and actually nurturing her. He spent his mornings with Victoria now, sharing breakfast and discussing her reading assignments before departing for the office. He arrived home earlier in the evenings and had started cooking dinner with Maria, learning family recipes that created warmth in their expansive kitchen. Most significantly, he had begun to see Maria not as an employee who happened to love his daughter, but as a partner in the complex work of raising a child who had experienced profound loss and was now navigating a new understanding of her own mortality and strength. "Are you nervous about the meeting?" Victoria asked, studying Maria's expression with the perceptiveness that had always made her seem older than her chronological age. "A little," Maria admitted. "Your father is offering me things I never imagined possible, but I want to make sure we're all making decisions for the right reasons. Big changes can be complicated, even when they're good changes." Victoria closed her book and moved to sit beside Maria on the reading chair, a piece of furniture that was just large enough for both of them if they didn't mind being close. "You know what I learned in the hospital?" "What's that?" "I learned that loving someone means trusting them to make decisions that are good for you, even when those decisions are scary. I was terrified of the surgery, but I trusted you to stay with me, and that made it possible." Victoria paused, considering her words. Maybe trusting Daddy to make good decisions about our family is the same kind of thing. Maria felt a familiar tightness in her chest at Victoria's use of the word "are" to describe their family unit. Over the past 3 weeks, as Victoria recovered and the three of them had settled into new routines, the boundaries between employer and employee had continued to blur until they seemed almost meaningless. The meeting took place in Robert's home office, a room that had once felt intimidating to Maria with its expensive artwork and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with business texts and architectural journals. Today, however, Robert had rearranged the furniture to create a more intimate setting, 3 comfortable chairs arranged around a small table rather than the formal desk setup that usually dominated the space. James Morrison was also present, but in a different capacity than usual. Rather than managing Robert's schedule or fielding business calls, he was there as a legal witness to document the agreements that were about to be formalized. "I want to begin," Robert said, settling into his chair with an ease that suggested he had given considerable thought to this conversation, by acknowledging something that should have been obvious to me years ago. "Maria, you haven't been our employee for a long time. You've been Victoria's second parent, and you've been better at that job than I was for most of the time since Catherine died." Maria felt Victoria reach for her hand, a gesture of support that reminded her how much this 12-year-old had already learned about navigating complex emotional territory. "The legal documents James has prepared today will formalize what's already been true in practice," Robert continued. "They establish you as Victoria's co-guardian with full authority to make decisions about her education, healthcare, and general welfare. They also establish a trust fund that will provide for your financial security regardless of any changes in our family circumstances." James opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of legal documents, each page marked with colored tabs indicating where signatures would be required. "These guardianship papers have been reviewed by family court judges and will be legally binding once signed by all parties," he explained. "They're unusual in that they create a 3-party guardianship structure rather than the typical 2-parent model, but the circumstances clearly justify the arrangement." Maria stared at the documents, still processing the magnitude of what was being offered. Legal guardianship would give her rights and responsibilities that went far beyond anything she had ever imagined. She would be able to make medical decisions for Victoria, enroll her in schools, even inherit custody if something happened to Robert. "The trust fund," Robert said, "is structured to provide you with an annual income equivalent to what a senior executive at my company might earn, along with full healthcare benefits and a retirement plan. You'll never need to worry about financial security again, for yourself or for your family." Victoria squeezed Maria's hand more tightly. "It means we're really a family now, doesn't it? Not just in our hearts, but in the way the world sees us too." The simplicity of Victoria's understanding cut through the complexity of legal language and financial arrangements to the essential truth of what was being offered. This wasn't just about money or legal status, it was about recognition, about acknowledgement of love that had been growing for 8 years without formal acknowledgement. "There's one more thing," Robert said, and Maria detected a note of nervousness in his voice that she had never heard before. "I know that accepting this guardianship means taking on enormous responsibility, and I want to make sure you have the resources to handle that responsibility properly. James has also prepared papers to establish you as a co-owner of the beach house property in the Hamptons." Maria's eyes widened. The Hampton house was worth millions, a sprawling oceanfront property that the Manning family had used for summer vacations and weekend retreats for years. "It needs updating," Robert continued, "and I thought you and Victoria might enjoy planning the renovations together. Turn it into the beach house you've been imagining in your stories." Victoria let out a small gasp of excitement, then looked at Maria with eyes bright with anticipation. "We could really do it. All those plans we made, all those conversations about gardens and hammocks and reading nooks, we could make them all real." Maria felt overwhelmed by the generosity of what was being offered, but also by the weight of responsibility it represented. Accepting these arrangements would change everything about her life and her relationship with Victoria. She would no longer be someone who could leave if circumstances became difficult. She would be legally and emotionally committed to this family in ways that would last for decades. "I need to ask you something," she said, looking directly at Robert. "Why now? Why are you offering this now, after all these years?" Robert was quiet for a moment, considering how to articulate thoughts that had been developing over the past month. "Because Victoria's surgery taught me something about what really matters. When she was lying in that hospital bed, refusing to trust the best surgeons money could hire, I realized that all my wealth and influence were meaningless if I couldn't provide her with the emotional security she needed." He paused, running his hand through his gray hair in a gesture that had become familiar during Victoria's recovery. "You gave her that security. You made it possible for her to survive an experience that was necessary but terrifying. And you did it not because you were paid to do it, but because you love her." "I do love her," Maria said simply. "More than I've ever loved anyone." "I know," Robert replied. "And that kind of love deserves to be honored and protected, not taken for granted the way I've been taking it for granted." Victoria had been listening to this exchange with the serious attention of someone far older than 12. "Maria," she said quietly, "what are you afraid of?" It was a perceptive question that went to the heart of Maria's hesitation. She thought about her modest apartment in Queens, about her elderly mother and younger sister who depended on her income, about the simple life she had built over 4 decades of hard work and careful saving. Accepting Robert's offer would catapult her into a world of privilege and responsibility that felt both thrilling and terrifying. She would become wealthy beyond her previous imagination, but she would also become accountable for Victoria's well-being in ways that went far beyond anything she had experienced as household staff. "I'm afraid of not being good enough," she said finally. "I'm afraid that loving you isn't the same thing as being qualified to help raise you." Victoria stood up and moved to kneel beside Maria's chair, taking both of the older woman's hands in her own small ones. "Do you remember what you told me right before my surgery? When I asked what if I don't wake up?" Maria nodded, remembering the moment of pure terror when she had made promises she had no power to keep. "You told me I would wake up, and that we would start planning the beach house for real. You made that promise without knowing whether the surgery would work, without any guarantee that everything would be okay." Victoria's voice was steady and mature. "You made the promise because love sometimes means having faith in things you can't control." The wisdom in Victoria's words struck Maria with unexpected force. This child, who had just survived a major medical crisis, was offering her the same kind of trust that Maria had given Victoria in that operating room, faith that love would be enough to navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. "Besides," Victoria continued with a small smile, "you've already been raising me for 8 years. Now it would just be official." Maria looked around the room at the 3 people who had become her chosen family, at the legal documents that would transform their informal bonds into recognized relationships, at the opportunity to create a different kind of life than anything she had previously imagined. "Okay," she said quietly. "Yes. I accept." Victoria's face lit up with joy, and she threw her arms around Maria in an embrace that spoke of relief and excitement and the deep satisfaction of seeing long-held hopes become reality. Robert smiled with genuine warmth, while James Morrison began organizing the signature pages that would make everything official. The signing process took nearly an hour, with James explaining each document and its implications while Maria carefully reviewed language that would govern the rest of her life. When the final signature was completed, she felt both exhausted and exhilarated, as if she had just completed a marathon that led to an entirely new destination. There's one more surprise, Robert said as James packed up his briefcase and prepared to leave. Victoria, why don't you show Maria the plans you've been working on? Victoria disappeared into her bedroom and returned carrying a thick portfolio that she placed on the table between them. Inside were architectural drawings, fabric samples, paint chips, and dozens of photographs clipped from home design magazines. I've been planning the beach house renovation, Victoria explained, opening the portfolio to reveal detailed floor plans marked with careful annotations. I wanted to surprise you with how much we could actually do with it. The plans were remarkably sophisticated for someone who had just turned 13. Victoria had redesigned the kitchen to include a large island perfect for cooking together, had planned a library with built-in reading nooks and window seats, and had created a master suite that would give Maria privacy and comfort while keeping her close to Victoria's own bedroom. Look at this, Victoria said, pointing to a detailed drawing of the back garden. Sunflowers along the fence, just like we always talked about. And here's the hammock between the two oak trees. And this whole section would be for vegetables, tomatoes and peppers and herbs we could use for cooking. Maria studied the plans with growing amazement. Every detail reflected conversations they had shared over the years, casual comments about preferences and dreams that Victoria had apparently been cataloging and incorporating into a comprehensive vision for their shared future. When did you do all this work? Maria asked. During my recovery. While you were at the hospital with me, and then when I was resting at home. I wanted to show you that the beach house stories could become real, that we could actually build the life we've been imagining. Robert watched this exchange with the satisfaction of someone who had finally found a way to give his daughter something she truly wanted. The beach house renovation would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, but seeing Victoria's excitement and Maria's wonder made the expense feel like the best investment he had ever made. We can start the renovation work next month, he said. I've already contacted the best architects and contractors in the Hamptons. They'll work with Victoria's plans to create detailed construction drawings and manage the entire project. Over the following days, as news of Maria's new status in the Manning family became known, the reactions from their extended social circle were complex and sometimes surprising. Some of Robert's business associates expressed confusion about the unusual guardianship arrangement, while others admired his decision to formally recognize someone who had clearly earned such trust and responsibility. Victoria's private school initially struggled with how to classify Maria in their records, ultimately creating a new category of co-guardian that accommodated the unique nature of their family structure. The school's headmistress, Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, had known Victoria since kindergarten and had witnessed the positive changes in the girl's academic performance and social development since Maria's role had been formalized. It's remarkable, Dr. Hawthorne told Robert during a parent conference, how much more confident and engaged Victoria has become since her surgery. She's participating more in class discussions, taking on leadership roles in group projects, and seems genuinely excited about her future in ways we hadn't seen before. The transformation was indeed visible to everyone who knew Victoria well. The girl who had once been quiet and somewhat withdrawn had become more outgoing and adventurous. She joined the school's debate team, started taking violin lessons to complement her piano skills, and began talking seriously about wanting to study medicine when she was older. I want to understand what happened to me, she explained to Maria one afternoon as they worked together on college preparatory coursework that Victoria had requested despite being only 13. I want to learn about hearts and surgery and how to help other kids who are scared of medical procedures. Maria encouraged this interest, recognizing that Victoria's experience with her own medical crisis had given her unusual insight into the emotional needs of pediatric patients. They began volunteering together at the children's hospital where Victoria had been treated, reading stories to younger patients and helping with art therapy programs. Dr. Pierce, who had performed Victoria's surgery, was impressed by her knowledge and maturity when they encountered him during one of their volunteer sessions. She has remarkable empathy for such a young person, he told Maria. And her understanding of cardiac procedures is quite sophisticated. If she maintains this interest, she could make an excellent physician someday. The beach house renovation became a project that occupied much of their attention throughout the spring and summer months. Victoria threw herself into every aspect of the planning process, working with architects to refine her initial designs and spending hours researching materials and finishes that would create the warm, welcoming atmosphere she had envisioned. Maria found herself learning about construction management, interior design, and landscape architecture as she helped coordinate the various aspects of the renovation. It was challenging work, but also deeply satisfying to see Victoria's dreams taking physical form in the creation of spaces designed specifically for their shared life. The sunflower garden was planted in early June, with Victoria and Maria working side by side to prepare the soil and space the seeds according to the package instructions. Maria taught Victoria traditional gardening techniques she had learned from her own mother, while Victoria researched optimal growing conditions and fertilizer schedules online. "Do you think they'll actually grow as tall as we hoped?" Victoria asked one afternoon as they watered the newly sprouted seedlings. "I think they'll grow exactly as tall as they're supposed to grow," Maria replied. "Sometimes that's taller than we expect, sometimes it's not quite as tall as we hoped, but either way, they'll be beautiful." It was a philosophy that seemed to apply to more than just gardening. Their unconventional family had grown in ways none of them had originally expected, becoming something richer and more complex than the simple employer-employee relationship it had started as. Robert's role in this transformation had been perhaps the most surprising element of all. The man who had once treated emotional problems as business challenges had learned to appreciate the value of relationships that couldn't be quantified in financial terms. He began spending more time at the beach house as the renovation progressed, working from a home office that Victoria had specifically included in her renovation plans. "I like having you here," Victoria told him one evening as they sat on the newly completed deck watching the sunset over the Atlantic Ocean. "It feels like we're actually a family when we're all together." "We are a family," Robert replied, and for the first time since Catherine's death, he truly believed it. "We're just a different kind of family than most people expect." Maria, who was sitting in the hammock Victoria had dreamed about for years, listened to this conversation with deep contentment. The legal documents that formalized her role in Victoria's life had been important, but this moment of quiet togetherness was what really mattered. They had created something that transcended traditional categories, something built on love and trust and mutual commitment to each other's well-being. As autumn arrived and Victoria began her 8th grade year, the rhythms of their life settled into comfortable patterns that incorporated both their previous routines and new traditions that reflected their evolved family structure. Victoria continued her academic excellence while pursuing her growing interest in medicine. Maria balanced her guardianship responsibilities with her own continuing education and child development, and Robert maintained his business success while prioritizing family time in ways he had never managed before. The beach house, now fully renovated according to Victoria's vision, became their weekend retreat and summer home. The sunflowers had indeed grown taller than expected, creating a golden wall along the back fence that could be seen from every room in the house. The hammock stretched between the oak trees exactly as Victoria had imagined, and the library with its built-in reading nooks had become their favorite space for quiet evenings. But perhaps the most significant transformation was the one that couldn't be measured or photographed or documented in legal papers. It was the transformation of 3 people who had been living with unacknowledged loneliness into a family that chose each other deliberately and completely. On Victoria's 14th birthday, as they sat around the kitchen table in the beach house sharing a homemade cake that Maria and Victoria had baked together, Robert raised his glass in a toast that captured the essence of what they had built. "To Victoria," he said, "for teaching us that the most important things in life can't be bought or negotiated, only earned through love and trust. And to Maria, for loving us both enough to make us a real family." Victoria raised her own glass with the solemnity of someone who understood the significance of the moment. "To our family," she said. "To beach houses and sunflowers and promises we keep." Maria wiped tears from her eyes as she raised her glass to meet theirs. "To love that grows stronger than we ever imagined possible." Outside, the ocean waves continued their eternal rhythm, and the sunflowers swayed in the evening breeze, and in the warm light of the kitchen they had designed together, 3 people who had found each other across lines of class and employment and traditional family structures celebrated the bonds that had made them whole. The girl who had once refused to trust anyone except her housekeeper had grown into a young woman who understood that love creates its own qualifications, its own authority, its own legitimacy. The billionaire who had once believed that money could solve any problem had learned that some things, the most important things, could only be earned through presence and devotion and the willingness to acknowledge what really matters. And the housekeeper who had once seen herself as someone who cared for other people's families had discovered that love doesn't follow employment boundaries, that sometimes the most profound relationships begin with the simple decision to show up every day and care about someone else's well-being more than your own comfort. Together, they had created something unprecedented and precious, a family built not on biology or marriage or social convention, but on the radical decision to choose each other, to honor each other, and to build a life together that recognized love as the most important qualification of all. In the end, that choice had made all the difference. 5 years later, Victoria Manning stood at the podium of Columbia University's medical school auditorium, her white coat pristine and her stethoscope draped around her neck like a badge of honor. At 19, she was the youngest student in her class, having accelerated through her undergraduate studies with the focused determination of someone who had discovered her calling early and pursued it relentlessly. The audience before her consisted of fellow medical students, faculty members, and distinguished guests who had gathered for the annual symposium on pediatric cardiac care. But Victoria's attention was focused on two people sitting in the front row, Robert, now 53 and showing distinguished silver at his temples, and Maria, 46 and radiant with pride as she watched the girl she had helped raise achieve a dream that had been born in a hospital room years earlier. When I was 12 years old, Victoria began, her voice clear and confident, I learned that trust isn't something you can purchase or demand. It's something that must be earned through consistent love and presence, even in the most frightening moments of life. She paused, her eyes finding Maria's in the audience. The woman who had once been their housekeeper now served on the board of directors for the Manhattan Children's Heart Foundation, an organization Victoria had established 2 years earlier to provide emotional support services for pediatric cardiac patients and their families. The person who saved my life wasn't the skilled surgeon who repaired my heart, though his expertise was crucial. It wasn't the advanced medical technology that monitored my vital signs, though that equipment was essential. The person who saved my life was someone the medical establishment had never trained, someone whose qualifications existed entirely in the realm of love rather than credentials. Victoria's presentation focused on a revolutionary program she had developed during her clinical rotations, one that paired pediatric patients with specially trained emotional support advocates who stayed with children throughout major medical procedures. The program had shown remarkable results in reducing patient anxiety, improving surgical outcomes, and creating more positive healthcare experiences for families facing medical crises. We call them heart guardians, Victoria explained, clicking to a slide that showed children and their advocates during various medical procedures. These aren't medical professionals in the traditional sense. They're individuals who have demonstrated exceptional capacity for providing comfort and security to children in medical settings. They undergo specialized training, but their primary qualification is their ability to love unconditionally. The program had already been implemented in 3 major hospitals across New York, with plans for national expansion once Victoria completed her medical degree. The results spoke for themselves. Pediatric patients with heart guardians showed 50% less presurgical anxiety, required less anesthesia, and recovered more quickly than control groups. Dr. Pierce, now serving as Victoria's mentor and the program's medical director, watched from the back of the auditorium with deep satisfaction. The scared 12-year-old who had refused to trust any surgeon had grown into a confident young woman who was revolutionizing pediatric care by recognizing the medical value of emotional security. After the presentation, as the audience dispersed and Victoria accepted congratulations from faculty and fellow students, she made her way to where Robert and Maria waited. The 3 of them had maintained their close family bond despite the changes that came with Victoria's academic pursuits and increasing independence. "I'm so proud of you, Mija," Maria said, embracing Victoria with the same fierce love she had shown that terrified 12-year-old years earlier. "Your mother would be amazed to see what you've accomplished." Victoria held the embrace tightly, still finding comfort in Maria's presence even as she had grown into an accomplished young woman. None of this would have been possible without you. The program, medical school, everything, it all started with you showing me what real care looks like. Robert joined their embrace, something that had become natural over the years as their family dynamic had evolved. You've turned your experience into something that will help thousands of other children. That's the most meaningful legacy anyone could create. As they walked together through the university campus toward the restaurant where they planned to celebrate Victoria's successful presentation, Maria reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. The modest apartment in Queens had been replaced by a beautiful brownstone near Central Park. Her elderly mother now lived in a comfortable assisted living facility with round-the-clock care. Her younger sister had been able to attend college and was now a successful teacher, her education funded by the trust Robert had established. But more than the financial security, Maria treasured the family she had gained. Victoria's success felt like a shared achievement, the result of years of collaborative nurturing and support. Robert had become not just an employer who recognized her value, but a genuine friend and co-parent who respected her judgment and sought her counsel on important decisions. Their dinner conversation ranged from Victoria's upcoming clinical rotations to plans for expanding the Heart Guardian program to discussions about the beach house, which had become their refuge and gathering place for holidays and summer vacations. The sunflower garden Victoria had dreamed of still bloomed every summer, now taller and more abundant than they had ever imagined possible. "I've been thinking about something," Victoria said as they shared dessert, her tone becoming more serious. "I want to ask you both about a decision I need to make." Robert and Maria exchanged glances, recognizing the weight in Victoria's voice that usually preceded important announcements. "I've been offered a research fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital," Victoria continued. "It's an incredible opportunity. I'd be working with the leading pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country, developing new techniques for treating complex congenital heart defects. But it would mean moving to Boston for 2 years, being away from both of you for the first time since I was a child." The prospect of separation was difficult for all of them to contemplate. Despite Victoria's increasing independence, their family bond remained strong, and the idea of her living in a different city felt like a significant loss. "What does your heart tell you to do?" Maria asked, using the question she had posed to Victoria throughout her childhood whenever difficult decisions arose. "My heart tells me to take the fellowship," Victoria admitted. "The work they're doing could revolutionize pediatric cardiac surgery. Children who currently have no treatment options could have normal lives. But my heart also tells me that I don't want to lose what we have together." Robert reached across the table and took Victoria's hand. "You won't lose what we have. What we've built together is strong enough to survive geography. And Boston isn't that far, we can visit, you can come home for weekends and holidays. Besides," Maria added with a smile, "we have that beach house that needs someone to help plan next summer's garden. You can't abandon your sunflowers just when they've reached their full potential." Victoria laughed, feeling the relief that came with having her decision validated by the two people whose opinions mattered most to her. "Then I'll accept the fellowship. But I want to make sure we establish traditions that keep us connected while I'm gone. Weekly video calls, monthly visits, and summers together at the beach house no matter what else is happening in our lives." They spent the rest of the evening planning how to maintain their family closeness across the distance, discussing everything from shared meal planning to coordinated reading selections that would give them common experiences to discuss during their regular calls. 6 months later, Victoria began her fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital, throwing herself into research that combined her medical training with her passionate advocacy for emotional support in pediatric settings. Her work quickly gained national attention, leading to speaking engagements and collaborative projects with children's hospitals across the country. But she never missed their weekly video calls, and she returned to New York every few weeks to spend time with Robert and Maria. The beach house summers became even more precious as their time together became more intentional and carefully planned. During Victoria's second year of fellowship, she received news that would shape the next phase of her career. The National Institutes of Health had awarded her a substantial grant to establish a comprehensive research center focused on integrating emotional support services into pediatric medical care. The center would be based in New York, allowing her to return home while pursuing groundbreaking work that had the potential to transform children's healthcare nationwide. The night she called to share the news, Robert and Maria were together at the beach house, working in the garden that had become a symbol of their family's growth and persistence. "I'm coming home," Victoria announced over their video call, her face bright with excitement and relief. "Not just for visits, but permanently. The research center will be affiliated with Columbia, and I'll be able to complete my medical degree while directing the program." Maria felt tears of joy spring to her eyes at the prospect of having Victoria nearby again. The separation had been manageable, but it had also reminded her how much she treasured their daily interactions and shared experiences. "Does this mean we can start planning that expanded garden you've been designing?" Robert asked, referring to Victoria's latest project of creating a therapeutic garden at the beach house that could serve as a model for similar installations at children's hospitals. "It means we can start planning everything," Victoria replied. "The garden, the research center, new Heart Guardian programs, everything we've been dreaming about during these months apart." As Victoria returned to New York to begin this new chapter of her career, the three of them settled into rhythms that incorporated both their long-standing traditions and the new opportunities that came with Victoria's growing prominence in pediatric medicine. The research center opened 2 years later in a state-of-the-art facility that included clinical spaces, research laboratories, and training centers for Heart Guardian advocates. Maria served as the program's director of family services, a role that utilized her decades of experience in providing emotional support while allowing her to help train others in the skills that had once been purely intuitive. Victoria's work gained international recognition, leading to invitations to speak at medical conferences around the world and consultations with healthcare systems seeking to implement similar programs. But she never lost sight of the personal experience that had inspired her career, often sharing the story of her own surgery and recovery as a way of illustrating the medical value of emotional security. On a warm summer evening, as they celebrated the 5th anniversary of the research center's opening, Victoria, Robert, and Maria sat on the deck of their beach house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The sunflowers along the back fence had grown into a magnificent display, their faces turned toward the fading light like natural solar panels collecting the day's last energy. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if things had gone differently that day in the hospital?" Victoria asked, her voice thoughtful as she reflected on the paths that had led them to this moment. "I think about it sometimes," Maria admitted. "But I also think that love has a way of creating the circumstances it needs to flourish. Maybe we would have found each other eventually, even if the surgery hadn't forced us to recognize what we meant to each other." Robert nodded, considering the woman who had transformed from his employee into his co-parent and dear friend. "I think the surgery just revealed what was already true. You were already Victoria's second mother. The crisis just made it impossible for any of us to pretend otherwise." Victoria reached for both their hands, creating the physical connection that had anchored their family through every significant moment over the past decade. "I'm grateful for all of it, the fear, the surgery, the recovery, everything. It brought us together in a way that nothing else could have." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they made plans for the following day's activities, discussing everything from beach walks to garden maintenance to the latest developments in Victoria's research. Their conversation flowed with the easy intimacy of people who had chosen each other deliberately and completely, who had built something precious from the raw materials of crisis and love. In the distance, the ocean waves continued their eternal rhythm, and the sunflowers swayed gently in the evening breeze. Inside the house they had renovated together, the rooms held the warmth of shared meals and quiet conversations and the accumulated memories of a family that had been born from the simple recognition that love creates its own legitimacy, its own authority, its own unshakable foundation. Years later, when Victoria had become a renowned physician and Maria's Heart Guardian program had been implemented in hospitals across 3 continents, they would still gather at the beach house every summer to tend their garden and remember the frightened 12-year-old who had refused to trust anyone except the woman who loved her most. The story of the billionaire's daughter who would only let her housekeeper hold her hand during surgery had become a legend in pediatric medical circles, inspiring countless families and healthcare providers to recognize the healing power of unconditional love. But for Victoria, Robert, and Maria, it remained simply the beginning of their story, the moment when fear had transformed into trust, when employment had evolved into family, when three lonely people had discovered that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or negotiated, only earned through the patient, daily practice of loving each other completely. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.